A single question without boundaries becomes a hidden, invisible psychological tripwire designed for control. The manipulator does not scream or threaten. They simply sit back in the velvet chair and observe the ensuing panic. A perfectly tailored suit hides the intent, while the crimson tie reflects a predatory calm, mastering the quiet room. In the sterile silence of the office, the air grows heavy and violently cold, suffocating the unexpecting prey. They drop a vague inquiry about performance, letting the words hang in the dead space like a hanging blade. There is no direct accusation to fight against, only a vast, terrifying black canvas demanding to be painted with guilt. The human brain despises an unresolved void and instantly races to fill the quiet gap with paranoid explanations. Sweat forms on the forehead of the subordinate as their eyes dart frantically around the room, searching for invisible clues. A master manipulator weaponizes this exact ambiguity, forcing the target to do the heavy lifting of their own interrogation. The predator leans forward into the sharp light, keeping their facial expression entirely unreadable, projecting absolute, terrifying dominance. Every tick of the wall clock amplifies the pressure, turning the once safe corporate environment into a mental prison cell. They are not asking for a genuine update. They are casting a massive, invisible net, waiting for a desperate thrash. The victim stares into the abyss of the open question, feeling the structural integrity of their confidence completely shatter. Silence becomes a gravitational force pulling them under, while the shadow of the boss grows larger, consuming all rational thought. Ambiguity is the sharpest knife, cutting without leaving a visible trace. Ambiguity does not invite a casual conversation. It functions as a psychological vacuum, demanding an immediate, unprompted confession. The human mind craves structure and predictable patterns, but the open trap removes all boundaries, leaving only endless, terrifying possibilities. Instantly, the prey begins to scan their recent memory, searching desperately for any hidden flaw, evaluating every email and past conversation. This extreme spike in mental processing power is known clinically as heavy cognitive load, forcing the brain into overdrive. They are no longer fighting the external threat. They are battling their own profound insecurities, projected onto the silent room. The boss does not need to lift a finger. The victim is actively digging through dirt, unearthing their own buried mistakes. A micro-expression of sheer panic flashes briefly as a single bead of sweat forms, running down the tense jawline. In this isolated, suffocating psychological pressure cooker, every second feels like a crushing eternity, destroying the victim's rational thoughts. The manipulator understands this biological weakness perfectly and uses the overwhelming weight of silence to extract the desired vulnerability. An innocent person will often sound incredibly guilty simply because the extreme stress of uncertainty triggers defensive, chaotic speech patterns. The shadowy figure behind the desk remains perfectly still, letting the invisible psychological poison take effect, dismantling the prey from within. They watch the eyes of the subordinate dart wildly, tracking the complete collapse of inner confidence, happening in real time. The trap relies entirely on the target's imagination, transforming minor insecurities into massive, catastrophic failures, painted on the blank canvas. Without a clear boundary or a specific accusation, the mind defaults to the absolute worst, preparing for a brutal termination. Silence is the heaviest burden to bear, for a mind infected with doubt. The true power of a master manipulator lies not in what they say, but in what they intentionally withhold. By refusing to establish a clear perimeter, they force the bewildered subordinate forward, to wander blindly into a psychological minefield. Notice the calculated physical posture of the predator, leaning back in total calculated relaxation, projecting an aura of untouchable authority. They do not cross their arms or show tension, because true control requires absolutely zero effort from the one holding the leash. The crimson tie remains perfectly aligned and still, while the victim sitting across the desk slowly crumbles under the invisible weight. Withholding information is a violent act of dominance, creating a massive, terrifying power imbalance that leaves the prey entirely defenseless. The subordinate begs silently for a single clue, but the cold void offers absolutely nothing, only the echo of their own racing heartbeat. This tactical withdrawal of basic communication parameters acts as a deadly, blinding psychological spotlight, pointing directly at the panicked target. Every attempt the victim makes to guess the topic hands the silent observer yet another weapon to use in the final execution. The manipulator sits as a blank canvas of authority, allowing the terrified employee to desperately project every single deep-seated fear they possess. There is a sadistic elegance in this absolute stillness, watching a human being unravel completely apart, without ever raising a single finger. As the victim desperately tries to fill the void, they inevitably reveal their deeply hidden vulnerabilities, effectively signing their own dark confession. The shadow behind the desk grows larger and darker, feeding directly on the raw emotional energy bleeding from the terrified, exhausted subordinate. In the dark art of corporate psychological warfare, the one defining strict boundaries of reality holds absolute and completely terrifying supremacy. Absolute silence is never truly empty. It is loaded with impending destruction. The agonizing pressure of silent observation triggers the primal human instinct to offer unnecessary and often damaging justification. Justify is the first reflexive response of a panicked mind seeking to establish order where none currently exists. Without being directly accused of a single crime, the subordinate rushes forward to construct defenses against purely imaginary accusations. They mistake the manipulator's engineered lack of specificity for a profound personal failure that must be corrected immediately. Panic speaking produces a violent, uncontrollable verbal hemorrhage where critical strategic thinking is instantly sacrificed for immediate emotional relief. The manipulator remains a statuesque monument of stillness, watching the victim actively tear down their own professional credibility. In the absence of a defined target or scope, the panicked mind automatically defaults to its deepest, darkest insecurities and spills them all. This desperate need to be perceived as competent and right is a massive blind spot that a predator easily exploits. The victim thinks they are building a protective barrier of words, but they are simply providing a target-rich environment for attack. Every detailed excuse offered by the panicked employee is a new entry in a growing catalog of potential weaknesses. When you justify, you operate from a position of absolute submission, validating the other person's silent authority to judge your worth. Their silence does not require an immediate rambling response. It requires a strong, focused, and strategic retreat. The shadow of the boss grows longer and wider as it greedily consumes the raw emotional confession being offered. In the silent war of corporate psychology, the first person to speak is usually the first person to lose control. Silence is a powerful weapon, but justification is the hand that squeezes the trigger against oneself. The transition from justification to active arguing escalates the perceived threat, making the silent observer feel even more powerful. Arguing against a vague, open-ended question is an immediate tactical admission that you accept the premise of your own failure. The manipulator simply waits for the internal panic to create an entirely fictional conflict inside the victim's overwrought imagination. Every angry defense launched into the conversational void serves only to reveal precisely where the deepest professional insecurities lie. They are not attacking your work, they are watching you attack yourself, effectively providing the master blueprint for your inevitable removal. The quiet atmosphere in the corporate room thickens, transforming a simple open query into a finalized, fatal verdict. When you begin arguing over abstract points, you grant the other person absolute permission to judge your reality. The boss absorbs every emotional detail with predatory patience, updating their invisible dossiers with specific, actionable data. To argue with silence is to argue with a ghost, ensuring you exhaust all energy on a battle that cannot be won. This escalates the perceived guilt of the subordinate, purely because aggressive defensive actions always signal a hidden admission. Their calculated stillness remains a blank canvas of authority, allowing the terrified employee to project their own inevitable doom. The specific facts you choose to defend your work become the very knives used to slice your confidence. Instead of providing clarity and professional transparency, the argument creates massive fog, further obscuring the true objective. You believe you are fighting for your professional survival, but you are actively suffocating your own confidence. Arguing with an unstated accusation is the fastest way to lose. The most brutal form of corporate interrogation requires absolutely no raised voices and leaves no visible bruises. An invisible cage is slowly constructed, using the exact defensive words spoken by the panicked employee. They did not ask for deep secrets. The terrified subordinate wrapped them in sheer panic and surrendered them. Notice how the predator maintains absolute stillness, absorbing the chaotic emotional energy without offering any reciprocal data. This profound asymmetry in basic communication establishes a permanent psychological hierarchy that crushes the victim completely. The act of explaining without prompt is the behavioral equivalent of bleeding in a dark ocean of sharks. A master manipulator treats every excuse as a highly valuable raw material used to forge heavier chains. There is a terrifying mathematical efficiency in watching a target systematically destroy their own carefully built reputation. The open question is merely a mirror, angled to reflect the deepest flaws hidden within the frantic mind. While the victim swims in exhausting confusion, the silent observer categorizes every flaw with cold and ruthless precision. They gather massive amounts of tactical intelligence simply by remaining an empty vessel that demands to be filled. Every over-explained detail provides new ammunition, effectively loading the psychological weapon that will soon be fired. The true tragedy of the invisible interrogation is that the trapped subordinate believes they are actually saving themselves. They meticulously build their own psychological gallows, handing the hanging rope directly to the waiting executioner. The most devastating confessions are those that were never explicitly demanded. The inevitable conclusion of over-explaining leaves the exhausted subordinate completely defenseless against a non-existent attack. As the chaotic stream of defensive rambling slows down, a crushing wave of absolute exhaustion washes over the panic-stricken employee. They frantically pile dirt upon their own reputation, digging a terrifying deep psychological grave with their very own words. The massive corporate trap finally snaps tightly shut, fueled entirely by the frantic energy freely provided by the victim. Silence returns to the suffocating noir office room, but it is no longer empty. It is filled with heavy guilt. The predator does not celebrate or smile warmly. They merely observe the absolute ruin from the comfort of the shadows. Every single fabricated excuse and imagined failure now forms an inescapable heavy chain wrapped tightly around their neck. The sheer volume of their desperate confession permanently alters the psychological power dynamic inside the sterile corporate space. Without a single raised voice or direct threat, the mastermind successfully extracts complete submission from an originally innocent target. The victim suddenly hears the devastating echo, realizing they actively prosecuted themselves entirely in front of a silent judge. The crimson tie of authority remains perfectly undisturbed, while the frantic subordinate entirely collapses under their own cognitive weight. A desperate mind running on pure survival instinct blindly sprints directly into a hidden blade, waiting patiently in the dark. The invisible interrogation concludes with brutal mathematical precision, leaving absolutely zero room for professional recovery. or any future strategic negotiation. The shadows lengthen to consume the remaining light, marking the permanent end of their confidence and their professional autonomy. The echo of their own words builds the inescapable gallows. The moment of awakening arrives not with a massive roar, but in the sudden, absolutely terrifying clarity of a profound, near-silent realization. To break the heavy spell of manipulation, one must stop fixating entirely on the powerful illusion and observe the precise machine projecting the lie. The employee finally sees the intricate mechanism at work, realizing that their profound, panic-driven need to justify is the exact physical key that securely locked the massive trap. The internal chaos within their frantic mind finally subsides, leaving behind only a cold, chilling, razor-sharp focus, now cutting cleanly through the deep noir shadows. They look at Subject 01 across the desk, seeing not a superior, but a calculating predator, waiting for another useless move. The subordinate entirely stops swimming in chaotic confusion, realizing that any attempts at negotiation or defense are futile gestures that only feed the manipulator's powerful control. A powerful new form of resistance is born, originating not from a sudden outburst of anger, but from the deliberate calculation of cold silence. The rules of the game are understood completely. The only winning move available on this chessboard is simply choosing to no longer participate in jading. They observe the steely, steepled fingers, understanding that the manipulator relies almost entirely on the target's desperate need for resolution. The employee ceases to be the frantic prey by deliberately rejecting the heavy gan nank nyun tuk cognitive load that was violently forced upon them by ambiguity. The profound silence in the corporate room returns, but this time it is no longer heavy or suffocating. It is a powerful weapon in new hands. They carefully inspect the metaphorical gallows constructed from panic, preparing to turn the exact same devastating mechanisms against the executioner. The sudden stillness of Subject 02 is palpable, reflecting a mind that has entirely disengaged from the manipulator's narrative control loop. They are now observing the observer with clinical precision, watching the subtle facial expressions with an unreadable and chilling predatory calm. To break the trap of communication is the beginning of psychological freedom. The greatest threat to a psychological illusion is a sudden demand for concrete facts, dismantling the entire setup. Subject 02 does not offer an excuse. They simply reflect the heavy silence backward, forcing a tactical reset. A counter-question acts as a psychological mirror, reflecting the predator's own blinding spotlight back, neutralizing the immediate threat. By asking for the specific parameters required, the subordinate aggressively reclaims the stolen narrative, setting a new boundary. They politely inquire if the performance review focuses on a specific recent quarterly project or the broader annual picture. This simple clarification request is a tactical strike, destroying the weaponized ambiguity of the room with absolute surgical precision. The heavy burden of cognitive load transfers, moving instantly from prey to the predator, shifting the power dynamic. The manipulator can no longer hide comfortably. They must either provide a specific accusation or retreat into the shadows. Providing a specific accusation requires actual evidence, stripping the boss of their invisible power, exposing the hollow threat. Retreating means acknowledging the failed interrogation attempt, visibly fracturing the aura of untouchable authority, maintaining the new equilibrium. The velvet chair suddenly feels incredibly uncomfortable, as the crimson tie loses its gleam under the harsh reality. The victim simply waits in absolute stillness, observing the micro-expressions of the exposed manipulator, calculating the next move. An answered question is merely a submissive reaction, but a calculated counter-inquiry is a demonstration of profound mental dominance. The once terrifying blank canvas of doubt is shattered by a single targeted question, demanding absolute factual clarity. A counter-question is a mirror, forcing the predator into the light. The shattered illusion leaves behind a stark reality. where the true nature of power is exposed. A predator deprived of their psychological camouflage quickly devolves into an ordinary figure, stripped of authority. Subject 02 observes this profound transformation, recognizing that the vast corporate hierarchy is built on fear. True control never belonged to the loudest voice. It belonged to the one who commanded the silent spaces. The crimson tie now hangs limp and heavy as the shadows abandon the exposed mastermind, leaving them vulnerable. Manipulation thrives exclusively within the foggy darkness and dies when exposed to bright light of factual data. They gather their things with steady white hands, stepping out of the psychological prison cell, forever broken. The open-ended question was never a genuine inquiry. It was always a highly calculated trap, waiting for prey. A mind that refuses to blindly fill voids becomes a fortress against covert emotional abuse, standing incredibly strong. The once terrifying office space returns to normal, shrinking back into a mundane, sterile room, devoid of power. Every manipulator relies on the quiet complicity of a victim too terrified to speak and demand clarity. By returning the question directly to the source, the subordinate successfully cuts the invisible strings, achieving total autonomy. The profound silence now belongs to the survivor, serving as a shield against future attacks, forged in awareness. The dark game of corporate psychological warfare ends when the prey fundamentally changes the rules of engagement forever. He who asks the question holds the absolute power over reality.